Christopher Columbus discovered America, right? Sure. Now go ahead and delete that thought. Here's a brain breaker. He had no idea he'd discovered a new continent. He died thinking he'd just stumbled onto the edge of Asia. And the name America? Not his. It was claimed by someone else. A quiet, clever Italian guy with a talent for writing, Amerigo Vespucci. So if you've spent your life thinking Columbus was the father of America, let's be honest, you've been played, just like he was. This isn't just a story of discovery, it's a story of historical misfire rebranded as global triumph. Subscribe to our channel if you love slow, deep dives that rip the mask off history. And don't forget to comment below. Where are you listening from, and what time is it there? We're dying to know what corner of the world you're exploring this new world from. 15th century, an era without GPS, without reliable maps, and with a paper compass sense of direction. And Europe, which once seemed content and self-contained, was starting to fidget. You'd think they had everything. God, church, feudal hierarchy underfoot, wheat in the fields, endless wars for castles and family pride, hunting, plague, the Inquisition. But the world was changing. Rumors drifted from the east of exotic spices, fragrant powders, myrrh, silks, and satins. And all those temptations were flourishing in lands that, on European maps, did not exist. Picture this. If you don't have access to Persian markets, how do you write a proper scented letter? How do you tell a monarch from a cook without rich imported fabrics? Then came the tipping point. The fall of Byzantium in 1453, the Ottomans closing the eastern trade routes, and suddenly Europe was cut off. Left with two options: bow to new masters and pay the toll, or find another way around. Through the ocean, through what was at the time complete madness. Beyond the edge of the known map was what? A void? A sea monster? A turtle carrying the earth? No one knew. But someone eventually would get tired of not knowing. The old world was no longer enough. A new world had to be imagined. And when the world doesn't yet know how big it really is, someone has to show it. Genoa, a port city that raised more merchants than poets. It was here, around 1451, that Christopher Columbus was born. And from that very moment, it seemed history had misplaced him. Because Columbus wasn't a merchant. He didn't dream of profit. He dreamed of immortality. Imagine a man who, for decades, roamed across Europe saying, "I know how to reach Asia another way. Just give me 3 ships." They didn't listen. He came back, again and again. When Portugal refused his proposal, he turned to the court of Castile. Rejected again. He stayed anyway. 16 years of knocking on royal doors, being laughed at, ignored, dismissed, and always returning. Columbus was not a scientist in the strict sense. He quoted the Bible as often as Ptolemy. He believed the earth was round, but smaller than it really was. That Asia stretched much farther east, and that between it and Europe just a bit of ocean and a few tales of adventure. It was a fatal miscalculation, but one that sounded awfully tempting to monarchs who had just ended the Reconquista and were suddenly free from war. Isabella of Castile, one of the most formidable rulers of her time, didn't believe him at first, but she needed something big. The kingdom had just expelled the Moors from Granada. There was money, there was ambition. Columbus brought a map, half fantasy, full of promises, spices, gold, souls to convert. Isabella hesitated. Ferdinand gave him side-eye. The royal advisors all said no. Then Columbus threatened to leave for the French king. And suddenly, Isabella changed her mind. "Give him the ships," she ordered, and history began to shift. The contract Columbus signed wasn't modest. He demanded the title of Admiral, Viceroy over all discovered lands, 10% of all profits from spices, gold, or anything else of value, the right to judge and pardon, and hereditary titles for his heirs. This wasn't a travel permit. It was a declaration of faith in himself, in destiny, in divine backing. Columbus believed he was chosen by God. His journals read more like sermons than logs. He wasn't just looking for land. He wanted to spread Christianity, reach the great Khan, and bring salvation to all heathens. He wanted to redeem Europe through conquest. Finding Asia was just the cover story. He was really searching for eternity. And in 1492, after years of poverty, humiliation, and nights begging in monasteries, he got it. 3 ships, a crew of convicts, idealists, and gamblers. An ocean ahead. Asia, in his mind. America. Not even a mistake yet. Just an unnamed idea waiting to happen. August 3rd, 1492, a date that school books paint as a hymn to human resolve. The truth was a little less romantic. Columbus set sail with a crew made up largely of the unemployed, convicts, debtors, and desperate men. The 3 ships, the Santa Maria, Pinta, and Nina, weren't vessels of glory. They were floating compromises, barely seaworthy. Columbus aimed west, convinced that he would reach Asia in just a few weeks. But weeks turned into months. The water turned foul. The bread hardened, and the crew's patience frayed like old rope. When no sign of Asia appeared on the horizon, whispers of mutiny began to spread. Columbus kept 2 logs. One was private, the other public for the crew. In it, he shortened the distance they had traveled so they wouldn't panic at how far from home they'd drifted. This wasn't just a navigational trick. It was psychological warfare at sea. But pressure was mounting. On October 10th, 1492, sailors aboard the Pinta and Nina began openly discussing revolt. Most believed the expedition was suicide. Their faces were burned by wind and salt, their hands already gripping oars and tools that could double as weapons. The message was clear: turn back, or we'll turn you back ourselves. Columbus didn't draw a sword. He made a deal. He promised if no land appeared in 3 days, they would return. It was a complete lie, but it bought him time. And, in a twist fit for fiction, on the 3rd day, in the night of October 12th, sailor Rodrigo de Triana cried out, "Land!" But it wasn't Asia, not Japan, not India. It was an island now known as San Salvador in the Bahamas. Columbus stepped ashore with Spanish flags in hand and the unshakable belief that he had reached the outer edge of the Asian continent. The people he met, the Taino, he called Indians because he thought he'd reached India. It was a colossal geographic mistake, and yet it cracked open a new chapter of world history. The Taino were friendly, generous, and most importantly, wore gold ornaments. That was all Columbus needed. There's gold here, he thought. This land must belong to Spain. In the following weeks, he explored several Caribbean islands, each time convinced that just around the next corner lay China. He saw Cuba and declared it Cathay. He landed on Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti, Dominican Republic, and claimed it was the Asian mainland. Eventually, he left behind a small colony of 39 men, building a fort from the wreckage of the Santa Maria, and sailed back to Spain with his big announcement, "I found the way to India." He was welcomed as a hero. Bells rang, crowds gathered, and Columbus marched to the royal court with his head high. He didn't bring bags of gold, but he brought something more powerful, the idea that something lay across the ocean. This was not the triumph of science. It was a triumph of error, one that opened the floodgates to conquest, commerce, religious zeal, and a century of global shock. Columbus never learned he had found a new continent. He would return again, and each time he would search for Asia and never find it. Every great story has a hero, but this one also has a footnote writer who accidentally became the headline. Amerigo Vespucci was not the first man to set foot on the shores of the New World. He didn't lead a mutinous crew across the Atlantic, lie about distances, or argue with kings. He just wrote a lot, vividly, and with a far sharper grasp of geography than Christopher Columbus ever had. Born in Florence in 1454, a city that knew how to sell ideas as well as silk, Vespucci started as a banker for the Medici family. Later, he found himself in Seville, among merchants funding voyages to distant lands. He wasn't obsessed with Asia. He was curious about how the world actually worked. In 1499, he joined an expedition along the coast of South America with Alonso de Ojeda. He observed, measured, recorded, and most importantly, he realized these lands were not Asia. In his letters, especially the famous Mundus Novus, New World, Vespucci made a clear and revolutionary claim. These lands are part of a fourth continent, unknown to the ancients. Columbus, on the other hand, died still convinced he had reached the outskirts of India. He resisted anyone who doubted his geography. In his mind, the world looked a certain way, and that was that. Vespucci didn't argue. He just wrote. His letters were energetic, colorful, rich in detail, and they spread across Europe like wildfire. And thanks to them, in 1507, the cartographer Martin Waldseemüller labeled a map with a new name, America, in honor of the man who described it first. It's an irony that deserves a standing ovation. Columbus discovered new lands and died disgraced, believing himself an unrecognized hero. Vespucci, who basically went on a field trip and wrote down what he saw, got his name on the continent. This isn't just historical confusion, it's a rebranding of history, where the actual discoverer was boxed into the margins, and the careful observer became the label. So, was it fair? No, but that's how history works. Columbus is an epic novel with a torn ending. Amerigo is the epilogue someone read instead of the book. And now, we live in America, not Colombia. Though one country did give him a nod, Colombia, but that's another story. Columbus returned to Spain as a hero. Bells rang, crowds cheered, the royal court applauded. But, as often happens, glory lasts only until someone asks you to actually run something. He was to return to the New World not as a dreamer adventurer, but as an administrator, and that's when the problems began. On his second voyage in 1493, Columbus set out with 17 ships, thousands of colonists, soldiers, priests, and gold hunters. This was no longer a romantic solo journey. This was a state-sanctioned invasion. Their route passed through the Canary Islands to the Caribbean. On November 18, 1493, the expedition reached Dominica, then Guadeloupe, and finally Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic, where Columbus had left a settlement after his first voyage. The islands stunned them. Tropical humidity, lush green jungle, birds brighter than any flag, fruits that smelled stronger than cathedral incense. And amid this paradise, the charred remains of Fort La Navidad and the scattered bones of the first settlers. The Taino had rebelled. The colonists had been wiped out. Columbus took this not as a signal for reflection, but as a sign of betrayal and blasphemy. And he responded with force. Chaos reigned in the new colony. The Spaniards killed Taino for trivial offenses, seized food, took women, and punished resistance with death. Columbus, with no experience in governance, tried to impose order with cruelty. He established a forced labor system where the natives had to mine gold or face punishment. Indigenous people were beaten, tortured, hanged. Some contemporaries called it the Spanish Apocalypse. The Spanish colonists themselves were furious. They had been promised gold, but got fever, toil, and a governor who behaved like a mix between a monk and a tyrant. By 1499, the first complaints had reached Spain. People wrote that Columbus ruled through fear, executed dissenters, and pocketed gold. He was no longer a hero navigator. He had become a dangerous liability. In 1500, the royal court sent Francisco de Bobadilla to Hispaniola as a judge, inspector, and enforcer. Within days, Columbus and his brothers were arrested. They were chained and sent back to Spain as criminals. The man who had opened the Americas returned home in shackles. He begged to return, and though he was freed and even allowed a fourth voyage, he never regained his titles or authority. His empire ended before it had ever truly begun. On that fourth voyage, he explored the coasts of Central America, searched for a strait to India, and battled malaria, storms, and his own aging body. His ships rotted, his crew mutinied, his flesh weakened. Columbus died in 1506 in Valladolid, with no money, no titles, and no idea what he had actually discovered. The documents that had promised him wealth, viceroyalties, and glory had become meaningless ink. The story of the great navigator didn't end with a storm. It ended in a quiet hallway. No fanfare, no final salute. Why did he fail? Because the world is not just maps, it's systems. Columbus discovered a new continent, but had no idea how to govern it. He was great at sea and lost on land. He could conquer with a compass, but not with policy. And that made him obsolete in a world no longer run by exploration, but by the infrastructure of power. Imagine this, a land so lush, so balanced, it feels like something out of myth. Green mountains, crystal rivers, mango trees heavy with fruit. Children laugh in the distance. Women grind cassava into bread. The men fish by moonlight. No walls, no prisons, no war. This was the world of the Taino. And then, one morning, sails on the horizon. They didn't know that their paradise had just been marked for destruction. Columbus arrived. The Taino welcomed him with gifts, with food, with the kind of openness that only makes sense in a world untouched by conquest. Columbus, in his journal, called them gentle, said they were good as gold. And that was the problem, because to the men who followed him, they were gold. Within months, The paradise became a plantation. The Taino were forced to mine, to farm, to carry, to serve. Refuse? A whip? Complain? An execution? Run? They'll burn your village, hang your family, and worse. Then came the smallpox, measles, influenza, 100 bodies, then 1,000, then tens of thousands, dead without battle, dead without reason. By the time most Europeans had even heard the word America, the people who lived there were already dying. There were heroes. One of them, Enriquillo, a Taino noble. He watched the Spanish burn his aunt alive, a queen, and he disappeared into the mountains. And from there, he fought. For years, he led a resistance from the jungle. He ambushed, retreated, struck again, until finally, Spain had to sit down and talk. Enriquillo didn't just fight. He made a deal. Land rights, autonomy, the first victory of indigenous people over empire in the Americas. But it came too late for most. By the early 1500s, the Taino were nearly gone. Their songs silenced. Their gods smashed. Their children enslaved or buried. And what remained? A word, hammock, a tool, canoe, a storm, hurricane, shadows of a world now lost. Columbus didn't discover paradise. He burned it. And centuries later, we're still trying to understand what was lost in the smoke. Columbus died in 1506, quietly. No speeches, no honor guard, no grand farewell. He didn't die in a colony or on a ship or surrounded by royalty. He died in Valladolid, a far-off Spanish town that never became a shrine to his glory. He had no idea he'd discovered a new continent, no clue that the future would speak his name in tones ranging from reverence to regret, and certainly no inkling that he would become a figure history would still be figuring out 5 centuries later. In the years that followed, Columbus became a myth. To some, a hero, a pioneer, the man who discovered America and launched the modern world. To others, a symbol of colonization, genocide, slavery, cultural annihilation. In the 19th century, the United States elevated him to national icon status. In 1792, on the 300th anniversary of his voyage, Washington, D.C. was named in his honor. Then came Columbia University, Columbus Day, countless cities and streets. But by the 20th century, another wave rolled in. Decolonial movements, indigenous resistance, historical revision. Columbus was no longer just a man. He was a debate. Even in death, he found no rest. His remains were reburied 3 times, from Valladolid to Seville, then to Santo Domingo in the Caribbean, and finally, back to Seville again. Each reburial brought more arguments, DNA tests, disputed urns. To this day, no one is entirely sure where his bones actually are. Fitting, isn't it, for a man who misread geography in life to still be lost in death? Was he great? That's not a moral question. It's a question of scale. Columbus wasn't the first to reach America. The Vikings had come earlier, perhaps others too. But he opened the Americas to Europe's printing presses, monarchies, and merchant empires. He didn't bring back mountains of gold, but he unleashed a wave that turned scattered local worlds into a single global struggle. Not just routes, but networks. Not just islands, but systems. Columbus gave the world a geographic truth that Europe would later wrap in religion, politics, and profit. Columbus is a mirror. Every era sees what it wants in him. Some see glory, others guilt, and others just a statue to take down. He was a man with an obsessive idea, one that dragged him to the edge of the world and then tipped that world over. But here's the real lesson. The world is not changed by those who calculate perfectly. It's changed by those who dare to move forward, even when the map is lying. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of listener we make these stories for. Subscribe to our channel if you enjoy slow, deep, and fearless history. And tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? We want to know which corners of the world we've just discovered. Together.